serve as the Director of Student Programs at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, and I'm part of the Teach-In team. On behalf of the Center for Social Justice, the Center for New Designs and Learning Scholarship, the Division of Student Affairs, the Doyle Engaging Difference Program, and the fantastic individuals who comprise the Teach-In Planning Committee, Lionel Daggs, Tavon Toney, MC Chan, and Charlie Lewin-Smith, I am pleased to welcome you to the 2023 Teach the Speech Teach-In. We are thrilled to finally be reunited in person this year and to expand our reach by offering a live streaming option as well. Many, many thanks to Russell and Blue Street Productions for their AV assistance today. As we've come out of pandemic life in the US, we wanted to sit with the lessons we have or maybe have not learned in being anti-racist in higher education. Have we returned too quickly to the old patterns of operating here at Georgetown? Are we still exhausting ourselves in the pursuit of achievements, whether it's journal publications or leading student clubs? As Dr. King calls us in this year's text, how do we harness the drum major instinct in selfless rather than selfish service to others? What are anti-racist ways of being Hoyas for others? We are delighted to welcome Dr. Vicki Crawford and the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III to campus today. We've invited our speakers today to help us in processing by placing King's speech in its historical, educational, theological, and sociological contexts. Dr. Crawford will open our time together this afternoon, followed by a short audience Q&A. After a quick coffee break, Reverend Moss will preach the speech, a little different than teach the speech, and then I'll be back to close this out. It is our shared hope that by taking part in this community gathering today and reading or listening to the drum major instinct, we might meet the transformative thinking of Dr. King again anew. We want to thank all of you for carving out this time to participate today. I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview and orient you to this space in case you are new to this space, both physically and virtually, and our time together. So as some of you have just come from lunch together, this is a gentle reminder that food is not allowed in the auditorium, so please hide it right now. During our coffee break this afternoon, we encourage those on live stream to use that time to take care of themselves as well. We will continue on the same live stream link after the break. Reverend Moss's book, Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times, will be available for purchase during the coffee break as well, just outside Lorfink Auditorium, and he'll be signing copies of his book after his talk from 3 to 3:45 p.m. We are recording today's event, so if you choose to ask a question during Q&A, you will be recorded. For more information about today's program and to access our resource guide around Dr. King's speech, please visit the CSJ website, csj.georgetown.edu/teachthespeech. And while our teach-in ends officially at 3 p.m., we know the conversation continues. We encourage you to reach out to members of the teach-in planning team if you'd like to bring Dr. King's speech into the educational spaces of your classrooms, meetings, or student organization events. I'd now like to invite Campus Ministries Director of Protestant Christian Ministry, Reverend Ebony Grissom, to introduce Dr. Crawford. Reverend Grissom, as many of you know, has co-chaired the MLK initiative Let Freedom Ring since her arrival on campus in 2019, and we are so grateful for her presence here with us today. She will be leading the audience Q&A with Dr. Crawford after her talk. Thank you so much, Rev G.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Dr. Vicki Crawford is the director of the office at Morehouse College's Martin Luther King Jr. Collection and professor of Africana Studies. Acquired by Morehouse in 2006, the collection includes 13,000 of Dr. King's books and personal items. Dr. Crawford's work there includes developing campus programming and community outreach initiatives that advance Dr. King's teachings and nonviolent philosophy. It also includes directing a series of collaborative books based on works in the collection. She also serves on the curatorial committee at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which oversees rotating exhibits of Dr. King's papers. Last year's ABP students may remember experiencing some of her curatorial work there when we visited last spring. Dr. Crawford is a civil rights scholar whose volume of essays, Women in the Civil Rights Movement, Trailblazers and Torchbearers, was one of the first publications to address the role of women in the movement. She has published numerous essays and book chapters on the civil rights movement while teaching in African American history over the past 3 decades. These include, but are not limited to, Reclaiming the Great World House, The Global Vision of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Be Ye Doers of the Word, Not Just Hearers Only, Faith and Politics in the Life of Victoria Gray Adams, Women in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and Sisters of the Struggle, African American Women in the Civil Rights, Black Power Movement, Race, Class, Gender, and Culture, Black Women's Activism in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, and Coretta Scott King and the Struggle for Civil Rights and Civil and Human Rights, an Enduring Legacy. In April of 2022, Dr. Crawford was decorated with an award from France even that acknowledges the work that she's done in the civil rights movement, calling both sides of the Atlantic, even the whole world, to live into Dr. King's legacy. While her accomplishments are many, she reflects, my passion is the students. Her commitment to African American history and culture is evident in her scholarship and in her life. She earned a PhD in American Studies from Emory University, and an MA in journalism from the University of Georgia, and a BA from Spelman College. She also completed postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In addition to all of this, she is a cradle Episcopalian who worships in the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta. She's a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So you hear she has put in the work at the church, in the classroom, and for the culture. When I told her that I would be introducing her, Dr. Crawford said, "You can say something special." It is difficult to choose just something special because there are many. As an undergraduate, I majored in African American and African Studies, so I read some of her books and essays. Dr. Crawford was my professor figuratively and literally. I spent 4 years studying with her at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I saw her commitment to her scholarship, to her students, and her people. Her classroom was both an incubator and a sanctuary, a place where she encouraged, expected even, her students to take our scholarship seriously, even as her classroom was a cleft in the stony rock of a PWI. Dr. Crawford had high expectations of us, but always created a soft place for us to land. I have countless memories, but my favorite is when she took me to my first off-campus lecture to see Dr. Cornel West on my birthday. I think you bought dinner too. You remember that? Yeah. It was a really special nerdy girl birthday. Dr. Crawford taught me about cura personalis and being a woman for others long before I read about it on Georgetown's banners. On the hilltop, we aim to embody our Jesuit values and their synergy with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. daily, but intentionally, really, in January. For her scholarship on the civil rights movement, her expert stewardship of the King Collection, Dr. Crawford is a teach-to-speech lecturer for such a time as this. It is my deepest delight to present to you my forever professor, Dr. Vicki Crawford.
Well, good afternoon. Boy, Ebony, you're going to make me cry. I can't believe it's been so long ago, but as you heard, Ebony was a student in my class at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and we've come a ways. So I am really delighted to be here, and it's good again to be here and to be in person and not have to be virtual. I want to begin by thanking Reverend Ebony Grissom. I'd also like to thank Lionel Daggs and Dr. Ryan Craig, among others, on the organizing committee. When Ebony asked me to do this, I jumped at it because I love the concept. Teach the speech. That's just a wonderful concept, and I've looked over the years at the different speeches you've taught. And this is a very special one, so this was a great opportunity to be here and to study this speech, and so glad I'm going before Reverend Otis Moss III, who will preach this speech, but always great to share an opportunity with him. I want to just say he's a Morehouse graduate, my brother, former member of the Morehouse Board of Trustees, and of course he is one of the country's most gifted and prophetic preachers, so it's great to share this experience with him. As one of the most transformative leaders of the 20th century, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remains a preeminent figure, one whose thought, philosophy, and deep commitment to justice continues to endure beyond his lifetime. The establishment of a national observance in his honor serves to remind us of a life and a history that should not be forgotten. Yet the annual observances and memorialization of King often fail to recognize the complexity of his life and thought. All around and oversimplified, King is often reduced, to a mythic hero, the central figure in a master narrative that centers around an oversimplified analysis of one of the major movements for social change in the 20th century. Dr. King was a radical thinker and a courageous leader who dared to speak truth to power. He called for a revolution of values in America. He spoke out against an escalating war in Vietnam. He called out racism, nativism, and nationalism, and he articulated an expansive vision of humanity's universality, that all life is interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. Our annual observances and sustained engagement with King should address these radical aspects of his life. Fortunately, we can engage the radicality of King's ideas and actions through his own publications, audio recordings, and other materials that have been preserved in historical archives, such as the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection. Consisting of more than 13,000 items, as you've heard, the collection includes an unparalleled gathering of primary written documents, including Dr. King's iconic and lesser-known sermons and speeches, as well as correspondence with social, political, and cultural leaders all over the world. Texts from many of King's important 1950s and 1960s addresses and speeches are contained here, and often presented, in several drafts, showing how each was formulated and developed. Among the many treasures in the Morehouse King collection is a delicate handwritten outline of the drum major instinct. This draft is suggestive of King's masterful use of language. Along with other documents in the collection, it reflects upon the strong liberal arts foundation he received while a student at Morehouse College from 1944 to 1948, before going, of course, to Crozier Seminary and to Boston University, where he received his PhD degree. And as this and other writings in the collection show, Dr. King was a meticulous writer, always revising text and very carefully organizing ideas. While he is often remembered as a Southern African-American preacher and national civil rights leader, this collection demonstrates that he was also a remarkable scholar, theologian, and political thinker who read extensively to inform and deepen his ethical and political ideas. King's library of over 1,100 books reflects his broad interest in history, in literature, philosophy, as well as politics, and of course, the theory and the practice of nonviolence. On February 4th, 1968, Dr. King preached the drum major instinct from the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church, the church King co-pastored along with his father, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Sr., in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. Over a half-century later, the drum major instinct still remains one of King's most memorable and inspiring homilies, delivered 2 months before his assassination. An adaptation of an earlier sermon by J. Wallace Hamilton, the text is taken from the 10th chapter of the book of Mark, verses 35 to 40, which center around an exchange between Jesus and his 2 disciples, James and John. Both men make a specific request of Jesus, asking if they might each sit by his right and left side. Jesus responds that it is not a request that he can honor. It is something that must be earned through commitment to a lifetime of service. According to King, while James and John's requests might appear selfish, it's apparent that the desire to be recognized and to be out front is a basic human instinct. Employing the metaphor of a drum major, one who leads the band and typically garners the most attention, Dr. King develops this idea to suggest that deep down within all of us, there is an inherent desire to be out front and to lead the parade. It's human nature. King elaborates and explains that the drum major instinct often appears in infancy and follows us throughout life. At face value, it is not intrinsically a negative trait, yet as the sermon evolves, King points out that the drum major instinct can, however, become dangerous and destructive if left unharnessed. If left unharnessed, King warns, the drum major instinct can warp human personality to the extent that it perniciously influences individual desires, motivations, and actions. Preaching to his beloved Ebenezer congregation, King offers familiar examples of the negative impact of the drum major instinct on individual behavior, explaining how it can lead to snobbish exclusivism and self-serving egotism. He explains that it is this instinct that influences people to join exclusive organizations or that makes them vulnerable to advertisers, often making purchases that they can ill afford, all to be noticed. Ultimately, the drum major instinct can lead to attention-seeking behavior and a false sense of superiority. King extends his analysis of the drum major instinct beyond individual personality to suggest how it negatively fosters structural, systemic, and institutional injustices. Here, King leans in on another familiar theme that resonates throughout most of his sermons, speeches, and writings, particularly those over the course of the last 5 years of his life. This is King's articulation of what he calls the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, each of which persist as a challenge to building a nonviolent global community. Following King's logic, the negative aspects of the drum major instinct can also be implicated in the perpetuation of these triple evils. King explains, do you know that a lot of the race problem grows out of the drum major instinct? A need that some people have to feel that they are superior. And not only does this thing go into the racial struggle, it goes into the struggle between nations. Nations are caught up with the drum major instinct. I must be first. I must be supreme. Our nation must rule the world. And I am sad to say that the nation in which we live is the supreme culprit, he wrote. As King approaches the sermon's conclusion, he revisits the biblical text and cites Jesus' response to James and John. Rather than scold or condemn the disciples for their selfish request, Dr. King states that Jesus responds differently by transforming the notion of the drum major instinct from a negative character trait to a personality attribute. You don't have to give up this drum major instinct, he says, if you don't distort it and pervert it. Keep feeling the need for being important. Keep feeling the need for being first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity. In his response, King suggested that Jesus gave us a new understanding of what it means to be great. King then remarks eloquently, and you know this part of the text, If you want to be important, wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. King goes on approaching the dramatic turning point in this sermon when he says, "But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant." Everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love, and you can be that servant. Finally, in an unexpected and dramatic rhetorical climax, Dr. King preaches his own funeral and tells us how he would like to be remembered. And he states, "If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. Tell them not to talk too long. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want to say that day that I tried to be on the right side of the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I tried to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity." And in Dr. King's very last words, he stated, "Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness, and all the other shallow things will not matter." The beauty and the dynamism of this sermon lies in its brilliant and extraordinary delivery, an affirmative call and response from the congregation. This is a sermon that must be heard and not just read. As the grandson, and great-grandson of Black Baptist ministers, Dr. King reflects the genius of African American preaching. The very tonal quality of King's voice, its verbal cadence and rhetorical use of imagery and symbolism and other figurative language, serves to deepen the meaning and powerful impact of his words. Fortunately, the drum major instinct was recorded, though sadly and ironically, it was played 2 months later at King's own funeral. As we gather to commemorate what would have been Dr. King's 94th birthday, we might focus on his rich legacy of ideas and radical activism as we ponder King's words in today's time. King's personal leadership example and unwavering commitment to dismantling racism and other forms of injustice still provides lessons for living in the 21st century. Dr. King often used the metaphors, as you know, of the beloved community or the great world house to articulate a global humanitarian ideal. This was his belief in one human family connected around mutually shared values that would extend across the boundaries of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, nationality, and other differences that threaten to divide us. From King's perspective, attainment of a beloved community requires one to make a commitment to serving others and to becoming drum majors for peace and justice. It necessitates embracing radical love and the nonviolent struggle against the triple evils of racism, poverty, and war, as well as working to eradicate all forms of violence and human destruction. Over 50 years ago, Dr. King stated that, quote, "Racism can well be that corrosive evil that will bring down the curtain on Western civilization. If America does not respond creatively to the challenge to banish racism, some future historian will have to say that a great civilization died because it lacked the sole commitment to make justice a reality," end quote. Systemic racism persists. Hundreds of years of chattel slavery coupled with racially discriminatory policies have resulted in the marginalization of communities of color and of unequal access to education, jobs, housing, and other opportunities. Moreover, failure to reckon with the history of slavery further retards progress in our democratic society. Recently, the use of violence in policing has resulted in the killings of young African Americans. We can all recall the moments when we saw the recurring televised cell phone video of the murder of George Floyd. And we also remember Eric Garner, a New York City man who was placed in a chokehold while being arrested, ultimately leading to his death. And there's Ahmaud Arbery, shot while jogging in Georgia. And there have been too many more. Historians and sociologists point out that police violence is interconnected to race and class inequities and the complex interplay of privilege and power. African Americans in this country report being subjected to continuing forms of police abuse, including arrests, detentions, much more frequently than white Americans. In terms of incarceration, a report by the Sentencing Project to the United Nations on racial disparities in the U.S. criminal justice system indicates that the U.S. leads the world in its high rates of incarceration. African Americans here again are more apt to be arrested, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms. The issue of the problem of poverty persists. In 1968, when Dr. King delivered The Drum Major Instinct, he was working on plans for the upcoming Poor People's Campaign, which was a mass demonstration among a diversity of the nation's poor people, from the rural South, people from places like the Mississippi Delta, Tunica County, to Appalachia, among other places in the country. The group of more than 2,000 people would descend upon Washington for mass protests, and they set up temporary housing to demonstrate the plight of the poor. They were demanding attention to unemployment, joblessness, lack of health insurance, the need for fair minimum wages, and education for adults and children. In today's time, the COVID pandemic and prolonged loss of income have taken an intense toll on families in the United States, and childhood poverty remains a tragic problem facing millions of families. According to reports as of May 2022, more than 9 million Americans were unemployed, and some 19 million adults and up to 8 million children had experienced food insecurity. Moreover, African American, Latinx, and indigenous communities were hit even harder by the pandemic, facing higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and death. According to U.S. Census data, the child poverty rate in America is 16% nationwide as of 2020, resulting in close to 11 million children living in poverty overall. Black, Latinx, and indigenous communities, again, remain the highest among those facing low wages, joblessness, and reduced access to essential goods and services. Many within these communities face increased rates of unemployment and unsafe working conditions. Overall poverty levels are also deeply impacted by gender inequality, both within the United States and, of course, around the world. Despite some degree of social and economic progress, in no country have women achieved full economic equality with men. Women are still more likely than men to live in poverty, and the inability to exercise reproductive rights will surely impact women's control over all circumstances surrounding our lives, including education and employment. Finally, the current state of violence in today's world would be of grave concern to Dr. King. Russia's massive military attack on Ukraine poses a threat to democracy and has global implications for human rights and peace around the world. Millions of innocent people remain homeless and displaced, forced to live without access to food, water, health care, and other essentials. And the impact of this war has grave consequences for other countries far beyond the region. Here in the U.S., gun violence has reached epic proportions. Data compiled by the Gun Violence Archive indicates that there were over 600 mass shootings in 2022 alone. The terrifying shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, resulted in 21 deaths. In May of 2020, an attack in a Buffalo, New York grocery left 10 dead, and more recently in November, a gunman opened fire at a Colorado LGBTQ nightclub, killing 5 people and injuring at least 19 others. While these mass shootings in public places are horrific and widely broadcast, daily acts of gun violence and other forms of violence persist at alarming rates. Clearly, gun violence poses a human rights crisis in our country and is a leading cause of premature death. If Dr. King were alive today, he would undoubtedly remind us of the commitment we must all make towards dismantling racism, poverty, and war, and all forms of violence and human destruction. He would encourage us to commit to the advancement of human rights, where the dignity and worth of every human being is recognized. He would ask that we support the freedom of movement and residence for all people, especially those seeking asylum from persecution. He would warn us about the danger of self-centeredness and narcissism, and he would urge us to be careful to discern fact from fiction and to commit to a discourse of truth-telling. Finally, Dr. King would likely ask that we all become drum majors for justice, to be first in love, to be first in moral excellence, and to be first in generosity. And this, as he says so eloquently, we can all do with a heart full of grace. Thank you. Oh, yes. Now we will listen to an excerpt from the Drum Major Instinct, so we can hear the orality.
Every now and then, I guess all think realistic about that day when we will be victimized with what is life's final common denominator. That's something that we call death. We all think about it, and every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral, and I don't think of it in a morbid sense. Every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? And I leave the word to you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind, but I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word of song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian ought, if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain. Yes, Jesus, I want to be on your right or your left side, not for any selfish reason. I want to be on your right or your left side, not in terms of some political kingdom or ambition, but I just want to be there in love and in justice and in truth and in commitment to others so that we can make of this old world a new world.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Crawford, for your lecture on the drum major instinct. We have some time now for Q&A, so we invite anyone who is interested in asking a question about the lecture or about your work, right? Her work at the King Papers or anything else. We welcome your questions, so just come to either of these microphones.
Oh, great.
Hello, thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for that lecture. It was beautiful. I wanted to ask you, how has your work with the King Papers personally transformed your vision of Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy? Because, you know, like in the American narrative, you know, there are a lot of mythic stories about Dr. Martin Luther King, but I wonder how your work has you know, given you that nuance and the complexity of his character.
So thank you for that. It's really been an opportunity to work with this collection. When I went to graduate school and studied the American Black freedom struggle, I largely studied it from the ground up, looking at local movements and the critical role played by local people, which is so important, particularly in the rural South. And my dissertation was on the civil rights movement in Mississippi, particularly on the role of grassroots women like Fannie Lou Hamer and people like that, and names you've probably never heard of, which is why that work was so important. So when I took this job 13 years ago, I can't believe it's been that long, this was an opportunity to really see the movement from another point of view, from another perspective, and not from the bottom up, but looking at it in a different way. So there was a lot to learn. There was a learning curve, and it's a lifetime of learning. And so it was an opportunity to really be in touch with King in a sense that I, you know, beyond, as you said, the mythic figure, to pour into these documents and to see that, you know, see the humanness of King, that he, you know, was an extraordinary leader, but like you and me, I mean, he had daily struggles, and I think some of the documents in the collection show us that. He scribbled on all sorts of bits of little pieces of paper, and you know, had ideas, and he had some mundane life like we do, and you know, having to get groceries and things like that, and airline tickets. So you get a sort of sense of his humanness. And I had never, and Reverend Moss, you know, will bring so much light to that. I had not read King's sermons, you know, and not having a theological background is sometimes kind of difficult to do. But I was so happy to read the many biographies of King and some of the theological studies of King, and I'm learning something every day. Also, I want to point out two things that your question sort of calls up for me. The first is that however great he was, he did not act alone. A leader must have followers, and a leader must have supportive people around him. And so the study of King also teaches us about the study of all the many people who helped make that movement, that freedom movement of the 20th century, and the people whose names that need to be recognized, the students, the younger generation, who were the people who often went to jail, and were incarcerated for acts of civil disobedience. So it gives you an understanding of the scope of this movement in the country, that he did not act alone. He had people close by his side, like Coretta Scott King, his wife. His choice of a partner in life was probably a pretty good choice, because she shared his views, and she was very outspoken about the war in Vietnam before he could be. She had been involved as an undergraduate student at Antioch College. She was very active in the NAACP there, and she had a strong moral, spiritual, and political consciousness about freedom and freedom seeking. So he had in her a person that walked by his side. So you get a greater appreciation for that as well. Yeah. And I should say, the opportunity to teach about King and others is just an incredible opportunity to introduce younger generations to a movement that really was one of the major movements in the world. And teaching this is so important to me. So as I teach, I learn.
As we wait for other questions to percolate, I have some questions. I have a question. I wonder if you could talk some about, specifically when you brought out the service aspect of the drum major instinct. I wonder if you could talk about how that plays out for you, especially in your work with students and teaching highly capable, students who are rigorous, who undertake rigorous study and have high ambition for their life goals, how you also help them to center that or channel that ambition into a desire to serve.
So at Morehouse, we have a service learning component to general education courses, and I think this is great because it's an opportunity to get students outside the classroom and to be in the community and to actually, put in motion some of what they learn, intellectually. They go out and have to serve others in different capacities. We just had a very important initiative on this past Monday. So that is, to answer your question, that is one way that we see the connection between what we're teaching about service and actually going out and doing service. That is just a strong part of our education at Morehouse College. So that's one way we do it. And I'd like to explore this notion of service, because I think King means it in a deeper sense than just, you go out and you volunteer that day. Okay, so you've done your service for the year, but that we have to be engaged in really trying to improve conditions in our communities and working across, working across race, class, and gender, being outside of our tiny little circles that we travel in, but actually moving beyond that and being in places and spaces that, you might not normally think that you should, you wouldn't have thought to be in. So I think his notion of service is one that is a deeper idea than volunteerism. That really goes to a longer commitment to building a better world. Travel abroad that we at Morehouse, and I'm sure you have it here at Georgetown. Do that, Georgetown. It's so important because you get outside of your culture. And even if you can't travel abroad and live abroad for 2 or 3 years, you can at least travel abroad for smaller periods of time and glimpse how life is for other people beyond the circumstances that we have with us today. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm worried here at Georgetown that we have two sides of an international coin, where we have a very militaristic training in terms of foreign affairs, political science, And then we also have sort of a charity model of global health and, helping poverty or, famine reduction. And so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was such an internationalist. And often he gets pigeonholed into just a figure in American civil rights when he was such a global. He consumed the ideas from around the world, and he had ideas to share for the entire world. So how can we bring that internationalist perspective of Martin Luther King Jr. into our school, which has so much impact on the world, tries to have so much impact on the world? For example, when we focus only on the Ukraine, and we ignore Afghanistan and Yemen and Syria, we're behaving in a racist manner. So what is your advice for us? How can we bring together, how can we bring people who study international relations and warfare making into this conversation about humanitarian global issues?
Thank you for that question and for making the point about the internationalist aspects of King and what he has to say. You might have better ideas about that than I, let me be honest. I do want to say that one of the things that I'm learning more recently about King is about his global outlook. And recently I co-edited a book with Professor Lewis Baldwin, who is a religious historian, and the book is titled Reclaiming the Great World House, the Global Vision of Martin Luther King Jr. And I know that in King studies, the turn more recently has been towards looking at him from that global perspective. I think you probably have better ideas about in answering your question than I, but I know that I can say historically that he was very concerned about what was going on at the time in South Africa, and that when he went on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, that he stopped in London and he gave a really strong speech about South African apartheid, and he was concerned about this all over the world. So, I guess one of the things we must do, if I could, speculate about it, is that we've got to bring the globalist perspective into into our national conversations, and can't leave it out. So I'm going to answer by saying that I think you need to get to convene people and bring communities together to, first of all, have this dialogue.
I'm Marilyn McMarrow in the government department, and I teach international relations, but my question is, does the Morehouse collection have the original manuscript of the letter from Birmingham jail that he supposedly wrote in jail? And that if you do have it, and if you have seen it, could you describe it to us?
Well, what we do have is the letter from Birmingham jail that was printed in the Christian Century magazine. So we have that first printing in the Christian Century. We do not have the actual letter. And from what I understand, I don't know who knows where that might be. Because as you know, they were smuggling bits and pieces of the letter out of jail as King wrote it, because he was writing it on the margins of newspaper and little strips of paper, and they would smuggle out parts, and his secretary at the time would type it all up at the end. So I don't know where that an original first draft of that might be, but we have the printed version of that in the collection. But I should say, there's King material, written material all over the United States and probably around the world. There's the wonderful collection at Boston University with 80,000 items. I mean, there's King material in a collection at the Jewish University in Cincinnati. There's a lot of material in the collection of, I may not be pronouncing this right, Kyvie Kaplan, but there's materials in many different places and probably in people's personal archives. Yeah, so we're still learning and gathering.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture, and I was really struck by the images as well. I'm a nerd about artifacts, and so I like I'm just curious about sort of what is the life, like of these types of artifacts on the Morehouse campus. Are students able to engage with these things? Are members of the public roll up? Can we look at them, or or your scholars or anything like that? And then sort of related to that. Or are there like faculty who are using these artifacts in their classes across? That's something that is certainly top of mind for the folks gathered here. For Teach the Speech, folks will teach this in different disciplines and classrooms and things like that. So I was just curious if that's something that you're able to do with this collection at Morehouse in different ways.
Thank you for that, because this is called Teach the Speech. And the great opportunity with all of this is the opportunity for teaching and learning. And there's so many possibilities. Yes, we do teach this material. I certainly do, and I would like to, going forward, devote some time to developing a course where, perhaps a capstone course where students are working in the archives and working with these primary documents, and where we can have some close study of the documents. But we have faculty members who are teaching. We received a grant from the National Endowment for Humanities in 2013, and the grant was for teaching with the King Collection. So I'd love to see us, continue that work and expand that work, and we can even collaborate with people around the country to do that kind of work. I mean, I think that would be really rich, to have diverse campuses coming together over the summer, Summer Institute to look at documents and, and not just in this collection, but in some of our other wonderful collections that we have at our library in Atlanta. Atlanta Student Movement Collection for that reason, to teach and learn together. The general public doesn't really just roll up because it's in the library, and the public has an opportunity to engage with the collections at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which has a gallery devoted to exhibiting the collection. And what happens there is rotating thematic exhibits now we're going to rotate twice a year. And these are curated exhibits of papers based on a theme. The current exhibit, which just opened last week, is titled Now is the Time, which pays homage to this being the 60th anniversary coming up here on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And is, of course, a place where King delivered the speech that became I Have a Dream. So that's what the current exhibit will be. Unfortunately, the collection is not, it is digitized, but it's not available online. So you would have to, if you're writing a thesis or dissertation, travel to the collection and see it digitally in the archive. But incredible opportunities for teaching and for having our students explore the continuities and disjunctions between social movements then and now, which is exciting, for all disciplines.
Perfect timing. Thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you, Dr. Crawford, for your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have.
Okay, yes, thank you so much again. Thank you, Dr. Crawford, and so much for sharing with us today and for being here. Thank you, Reverend Grissom, for facilitating the audience Q&A. We'll now take a 15-minute break, coffee break, and we'll start back promptly at 2 o'clock. As a reminder, Reverend Moss's books are available for purchase in the hallway, and for those of you who are live streaming, you can stay on the same link. We'll return here in about 15 minutes. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tavon Toney. I have the privilege of serving as Protestant chaplain here at Georgetown University, and I also have the privilege to introduce our preacher, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. I first heard Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III as a student at Howard University, sitting in the Rankin Chapel service. I was enamored by his rhetoric and passion for justice. Years later, I met Pastor Moss at a conference held by one of my mentors and now ancestors, the Reverend Dr. Charles Edward Booth. And I was delighted to find out that the person matched the persona. Dr. Moss is a preacher whose voice echoes far beyond the pulpit, a pastor whose care goes beyond the walls of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, a scholar whose intellect transcends the ivory tower and the ebony village. He is a prophet for our time and a voice for generations to come, a successor to Jeremiah, writing poetry like Langston and telling stories like Zora. Dr. Moss is a welder of the sacred and the secular. In the spirit of our ancestors, he quilts together jazz and hip hop and blues to tell the good news of the gospel. In a day when politicians are conspiring to ban Black history from the classroom, he and his church are unashamedly Black and unapologetically Christian. Not Christian in the mainstream American tradition, but Christian in the sense of what Howard Thurman called the religion of Jesus. Christian in the spirit of Ubuntu, which says, I am because we are. Christian in the spirit of the tradition that inspired Dr. King to call us to do the work of building beloved community. It is in that spirit that he has led Trinity UCC to pay off millions of dollars of medical debt for people, affirm the lives and souls of queer folk, and to cultivate environmental justice in an urban garden called Imani Village, where formerly incarcerated citizens are able to take root and blossom in society. He is a native of Cleveland in my great state of Ohio, a Morehouse man, the son of Dr. Otis Moss Jr. and Miss Edwina, Monica's husband, and Elijah and Michaela's dad. And today, for the next few moments, Georgetown has the pleasure of calling him our preacher for Teach the Speech. Please help me welcome the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III.
First, I want to say thank you to my brother, Reverend Tavon. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and we certainly appreciate your witness and your work and your giftedness. And Georgetown is certainly blessed to have a brother who has come through Howard and has hung out in Columbus, Ohio, to be here at Georgetown. To my sisters and brothers who brought us together, this amazing committee for this Teach the Speech, I want to say thank you for the work that you are doing. It is unique, it is needed, it is necessary, it is powerful, and it is transformative. And so I am just delighted because many of the King programs you go to are celebrations without content. And to be in the midst of a place that has content, celebration, but is also calling people to serve is powerful. So I thank you. And I have to give a major shout out to my sister and also my professor. I would call her my professor because Dr. Crawford is an absolute gift, not just to academia, not just to the Morehouse community, but across this globe. I want to tell her publicly that your first book we utilized not only at Trinity for ministers in training, but we've also used your work as I'm teaching at, doing some classes at Mercer University so that they can see the entire mosaic of what the truth is of the freedom movement. So I thank you for your work and your scholarship. You are truly blessing us. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention, I'm from Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago, and amen, and wherever I go, I run into someone from Trinity. We are like Bebe's kids. We don't die, we multiply. And I want to thank God we have several members of Trinity who are on loan to Washington, D.C. Let me say it again, on loan to Washington, D.C. And I would just ask if they would just stand for this moment. We just so appreciate you all being with us. It is a delight to have you today and to make your way here. And on behalf of Trinity and on behalf of my family, my wife Monica, she said, you know, she thought about coming, but she said, you got on a plane this morning, you going back tonight? She's like, nah, I will check it out on the live stream. Hey, Monica, all right, you got your sleep, amen. And so we are certainly appreciative. I want to, because I'm just so very honored to have this opportunity to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I believe that there are several great orators, but considered to be the greatest orator and prophet of the 20th century and organic intellectual, in the words of Dr. Cornel West, would definitely be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you're talking about the 19th century, I think that there are two names that you have to also bring up that lead us into the brilliance of Dr. King. It's Frederick Douglass and Anna Julian Cooper. And those two individuals bring us into the brilliance of Dr. King. Now, I was told I was to teach the speech, but in no way would I intend to, quote unquote, preach a sermon that Dr. King has done. What I've done at Trinity just about every year, we take an idea that Dr. King has lifted up, and we do. I act as a homiletical DJ. All I do is I just remix some stuff that Dr. King has done, and hopefully people will catch the beat in the process. And so what I want to do is, again, lift up the scripture that he lifted up on February 4th in 1968, a few years before he passed away. And coming from the Gospel according to Mark, instead of the New King James Version, looking at the NIV version and what is known as the OM3 translation. That's the Otis Moss III translation, and that will be out next year, edited by Reverend Ebony, and we're so grateful for that. And it reads this way, beginning with verse 42. Not so that you, instead, whoever wants to become great among you, must first learn how to serve. And whoever wants to be first must be a servant to everybody. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. But first, you must learn how to serve. You must learn how to serve. I want to just to lift up again, remixing this idea of Dr. King, and just instead of the drum major instinct, to talk about the talking drum. The talking drum within the African tradition. There was something known as the griot. The griot was the storyteller, was the one who held all of the unique and powerful cultural history of a community, mixing together what today we would call to be the preacher, poet, and prophet all at once, communicating to the community and sharing with a generation that was growing up to make sure that they had the lessons of those who are no longer with us physically, but stand as the great cloud of witnesses. This was the role of the griot. And I would submit that Dr. King was our prophetic griot. But there is a particular problem. And I borrow from Dr. Vincent Harding, who shared a particular poem by a person by the name of Wendell Holmes, a few years after Dr. King was assassinated. Holmes wrote this poem that I believe encapsulates in totality the way in which America deals with this great prophet. The poem goes this way. It begins by saying, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him and build monuments to his glory. Sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge the images we would fashion from their lives. It is easier to build monuments than to make a better world. Now that he is safely dead. And the challenge across these United States of America, or in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, these yet to be United States of America, that there will be king celebrations across the United States. They will gather to honor a king, a de-radicalized king, a king that never lived, a king fashioned in the acceptable framework that allows politicians to stand up who never supported him in the first place, to say that I am for the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, what is interesting is that he was noted by J. Edgar Hoover as being the most dangerous man in America. In one particular poll, Dr. Crawford, I believe it was in Georgia prior to his death, stated that he was the most hated man in the state of Georgia. But now that he is safely dead, everybody loves Dr. King. They like the king that has been domesticated and de-radicalized. But if we were to listen to the talking drum and this drum major instinct, that there is a call, a purpose that we find that can bring us back to the radicalized roots that Dr. King spoke of talking about transforming this fragile democracy that is yet to be, that we call America. In his speech, he was talking about this drum major instinct, this beat, this rhythm, this talking drum that every human being is born with, this idea that there's something in me that I not only want attention, but I want to mark out my purpose, and I want to mark out my meaning. And all I want to do today is not necessarily raise the questions that Dr. King raised, but I want to talk about how he got his drum major instinct. He didn't get it from Boston. He did not get it from Crozier. That the drum major instinct for Dr. King was built and designed because he developed within a village of resistance and resiliency. And often scholars want to lift up his work at Boston and lift up Crozier, but forget that he was already educated before he got there. That he already was rooted before he made his way out of the state of Georgia. I'm reminded of what my father said, that the village of resilience that he developed in the village of resistance that he came out of, that if you were to go down a place known as the 4th Ward in Atlanta, better known as Sweet Auburn, that when he stepped out of his house on Sweet Auburn as a young child, this middle-class home, he would step out, and on that side of the street were other middle-class homes. But across the street were what were known as shotgun houses. So on one side, the preachers and the doctors lived. On the other side, the domestics and the sanitation workers. He could not escape the collective challenge that black people were dealing with soon as he stood on the sidewalk in this village. He saw the domestics making their way to homes where they were not considered to be fully human. But yet, he also saw across the street the doctors who cared for them and said, don't worry about the pay, I got you. That in the midst of that community, but he didn't stop there. When he turned left and began to walk to the Ebenezer Baptist Church, before he even got to church for service, he had to pass by other people that were part of this particular village of resilience. One space before he got to church was the Harbrooks Funeral Home, which was owned by a black woman, the only funeral home owned by a black woman who was also breaking patriarchy and at the same time the lid of Jim Crow at the same time. So he walked by that and was able to witness and see someone who was breaking down the limitations that had been placed upon people who'd been kissed by nature's son. But then, after he passed by there, he then walked past the Atlanta Life Insurance Company that was owned by an African American, knowing that the insurance that was not only at the church, but also the insurance that was purchased by his family was purchased through a black company, the same company that was also financing and making sure people got bail during the freedom movement. He passed by the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, but did not stop there. He kept walking and then passed by WERD, Word Radio. And Word Radio was lifting up what was happening in the black community during this time period, sharing with him as a boy that there was a race riot or a lynching that would happen in part of the country, but also lifting up what other churches were doing around the city. He was hearing Word at WERD. Passed by the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, passed by a funeral home owned by a black woman, but it did not stop there. Then he passed by the AME Church, Bethel AME Church. And this church that one time was pastored by Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. And for those of you who are not familiar with Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, before James Cone said anything about black theology, it was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner who said, God is black. Because if you look at Jesus and all that Jesus has dealt with, obviously he has to be a brother. And so he is already passing by a church and hearing the sounds of black theology as a child. But it doesn't stop there. Then he walks past the Atlanta Daily World, the only black-owned daily newspaper in the nation. Now, those who've heard from Chicago, we know about the Chicago Defender. That has always been weekly. But the Atlanta Daily World was a daily paper that lifted up issues of lynching, but also promoted the power of historically black colleges at the same time. So now he has walked past all of these spaces. He hasn't even got to church yet to hear his daddy preach. And then he hears the sounds coming from the Wheat Street Baptist Church. William Holmes Borders, the preacher. And from my understanding, he would sneak into the balcony to hear Borders preach. Borders, who stood 6 feet 5 inches. And he would give a poem as a close for his messages many times. You've heard Reverend Jesse Jackson do a remix of one of his poems that is even in the archive here in the Library of Congress. It's a poem entitled, I Am Somebody. And that poem says, I am somebody. I am a poet in Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar. I am somebody. I am an aviator in Bessie Strong. I am somebody. I am a musician in Duke Ellington. He closes his message lifting up the power that comes out of this resilient community, the black community, that the Constitution said is only 3/5 of a human being. He is hearing this as a child. And then as he looks at Borders, a graduate of Morehouse College, we must remember that Borders is the one who played Jesus in the Atlanta City Passion Play. So at 12 years old, Dr. King already saw Jesus as a 6'5" black man with a deep voice. And then after passing by all of these spaces, before he gets on the trolley to go to Morehouse College, he passes by the Alexander Insurance Company, where a Morehouse graduate by the name of T.M. Alexander ran this insurance company, and it was the insurance company that ended up insuring cars in Montgomery when they were bringing people together for carpools. Because what the Montgomery authorities thought that they would then arrest every black person that had more than one person in the car. Well, what they did is Alexander decided that he would insure those cars, but he could not get insurance in the United States. So he had to go over to England, to the Lloyds of London, to insure cars in Montgomery, Alabama. And so what every black church did, since they had a bus or a station wagon, they were Uber before Uber was Uber. They were Lyft before Lyft. And all of a sudden, they were insured as taxi cabs so that they could take people around Montgomery so they did not have to ride the bus. It was a community of resilience. It was a community of resistance. And then Dr. King, as a child, as a young man, then stepped onto a trolley. And when he stepped on that trolley, because it was run by the Civic Authority of Atlanta, said that he had to get in the back of the bus, the back of the trolley, because that was the rule in reference to Jim Crow. But I like the way that my father says it, Dr. Crawford. He says that Dr. King, though his body had to get in the back of the trolley, his mind was always in the front, because he had so much somebodiness in him. By the time he got on the trolley, he never was a second-class citizen, and then took that trolley and stepped onto the campus of Morehouse College, and there a person by the name of Benjamin Elijah Mays becomes his mentor. Before you talk about Boston, before you speak about Crozier, make sure you lift up this community of resilience and resistance that Dr. King came out of, that allowed him to have this drum major instinct because of this talking drum. But not only this talking drum and this drum major instinct comes out of this community of resilience, but then it also nurtures his moral imagination. His moral imagination, the idea, for those who may not be familiar with this nice term, it means that you operate with a spirit of things that are not yet, but you operate as if they already are. A moral imagination means that we can paint and create a canvas of what is possible in a nation, in a world, in a family, in a community, in this nation. And Dr. King operated with a moral imagination, but his moral imagination did not just come from himself. His moral imagination comes out of that particular community, but also because he is in a particular tradition. Let me help you out. That we are always lifting up Dr. King solely that he was the leader of the movement. But let me help you out. It is Olive Schreiner, who was a South African writer and also a feminist before the word feminism had even been framed. Who ended up becoming, in many ways, a person that influenced a gentleman by the name of Howard Thurman. And it was Olive Schreiner who used to observe nature, because according to Olive Schreiner, that if you observe nature long enough, you can at least get a glimpse of how the sacred operates. And as a child, she was staring at a small creek. And in this creek, she saw some locusts, one locust that had made a track to this creek's edge, to the river's edge. And the locust tried to get to the other side, but was swept away by the current. But then other locusts began to follow those same tracks and made their way to the river's edge. Some were swept away, but eventually they built a bridge to the other side. And it's Olive Schreiner who says, yes, they built a bridge and they made their way to the other side. But she raises the question, what of those who made a track to the river's edge and were swept away by the current? And she raises this question. She says, for every person who is on the other side of the river, you must give thanks to the people who made a track to the river's edge. They were swept away by history, but you wouldn't be where you are right now if they had not made their tracks. And we love in these moments, we love to lift up Dr. King, but we forget about this resilient community, this resistant community. We forget about those who helped shape the moral imagination of this man. And that before he was in Montgomery at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, there is a gentleman who served there before him, a person by the name of Vernon Johns, who was born in Lynchburg, Virginia. He only went to school 3 months out of the year because that was the requirement for black people, because they believed in Virginia that you really need to be in the field working. But Vernon Johns had a vision that he would go to college. He would go to college in Ohio, at a place called Oberlin University. And so he then applied for Oberlin at that moment. But he knew something. He said, if I put my application in, it'll take roughly about 5 days to get onto the Oberlin campus. So what he did is he packed up all his clothes, and he was going to arrive the exact same day his application arrived. Because he said, if they're going to deny me, they're going to deny me to my face. So he showed up at the dean's office saying, I'm reporting for duty. I'm ready for school. My name is Vernon Johns from Lynchburg, Virginia. And the dean was completely stunned seeing this person, kissed by nature's son, standing in his office with an entire trunk ready to start school. And he's shuffling around on his desk looking for his application and finds it. He says, oh, Vernon, your application just came here today. And he opens it up and he says, oh, son, you don't have enough credits to come to Oberlin. And without missing a beat, he said, well, do you want brains or do you want credits? I got the brains. I may not have the credits. And the dean was a little bit annoyed. He said, son, you have to learn how to read fluently in Greek. And he says back to the dean, he says, Dean, is that a Greek book behind you? And pulls the Greek book off and reads it fluently and says, again, do you want brains or credits? I got the brains. He was annoyed. He said, that was a nice trick, but you also have to read Hebrew fluently. He then grabs a Hebrew book off the shelf and reads it fluently. He enters into the school. They allow him. He graduates second in his class, and then he is called to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And here are some of the actual sermons that he preached. One of the sermons was, is heaven segregated? Now imagine preaching that in 1939 or 1940. Then here's another message that he actually preached. Is it legal to lynch Negroes in Alabama? And he put the message on the billboard outside before he preached it. And the police came by, the sheriff drove by, and then they arrested Vernon Johns before he preached the sermon. You got to be a bad brother to get arrested for something you ain't preached yet. And so he gets arrested. They bring him in to, they bring him into the police station. And they say, of course, they would not call him Reverend Johns. They would not call him Dr. Johns. They just said, Vernon, boy, you got to tell us what you're going to preach on Sunday. And he looked around. He saw several men with sidearms. And he said, and Vernon Johns, with his quick wit, said, I'd be more than happy to. And he takes his hat off. He says, but I'm a Baptist preacher. And in order for me to preach, and offers his hat out and says, I got to take an offering first. And of course, they laugh and they let him go at that moment. But every Sunday, he keeps pushing and talking about classism in the church. He keeps pushing and talking about how they must be committed to transforming the community. He keeps pushing Sunday after Sunday, saying that we just can't worship here. We've got to be doing something in the community. And eventually, the deacons got sick of him, and they put him out. And so the deacons got together, and they said, we're never going to have this problem again. The next person we call is going to be somebody we can control, somebody young. We can tell them what to do. And one of the deacons says, I heard about a young man in Boston named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the rest is history. But if it had not been for Vernon Johns making a track to the river's edge, there would be no drum major instinct for a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But we have to celebrate and recognize those individuals who go before us. And one that we don't even many times lift up. We lift up Dr. King as being the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. But you need to understand how that came out of some chaotic movement happening in Montgomery. There were a bunch of leaders in the basement of a church, and they were kind of arguing about, basically who's going to lead. Bunch of guys, they're arguing about who's going to lead. Rosa Parks had been arrested, and it must be understood that Rosa Parks was not just some sweet elderly person. Rosa Parks was a part of the freedom movement before even anybody was talking about the freedom movement. And she was not the first to be arrested. It was a woman by the name of Claudette Colvin, but they didn't think that she had the profile that we should utilize in reference to the movement. And so here are all the guys. Dr. King is in the back. He's new. He's 26. He's keeping his mouth shut. And they're arguing about what should we do? Who's going to lead? What are we going to do? And some are saying we only need to have a boycott for a few days. Others are saying turn it over to the NAACP. Allow them. This will be part of the Legal Defense Fund. What are we going to do? But in the back also, there were some women in the back. One led by a sister by the name of Joanne Robinson. And Joanne Robinson, who ran the Women's Political Council, was tired of hearing all this, and then Brooke brought the sister and said, let's go on over to Alabama State University where I work. We're going to go ahead and make some flyers and say we're going to have a boycott. But they didn't have a copy machine, but there were no copy machines back there. There was called a mimeograph machine. For anybody who knows anything about that, for those who are completely confused with what I said, a mimeograph machine, you got to crank that thing to put out some flyers. They put out 55,000 flyers, I believe it was in 8 hours, and made sure that every black household had a flyer the next morning. And so when Dr. King got up, had his coffee and his paper, he got a flyer too saying that there was a bus boycott, and that bus boycott lasted over a year. But many times we do not lift the one who made a trek to the river's edge by the name of Joanne Robinson. It was the sisters who had organized this idea, but yet we seem to only want to lift up the brothers. Creating the moral imagination that we know of for Dr. King. His drum major instinct did not come out of nowhere. It was connected to a community. And when you are connected in community, you can be inspired through sacred serendipity and through the work of the Holy Spirit in a myriad of ways. If I may lift up specifically an experience that I have in terms of this idea of sacred serendipity and how this serendipity works in unique and powerful ways. It was in 2008 in our church, Mia, you will remember that there was a certain individual who was running for president in our church by the name of Senator Barack Obama. And as a result of that, there were attacks upon my predecessor, Dr. Jeremiah Wright, that took a portion of his sermon. And those in the conservative media were lifting it up as the worst thing that they had ever heard, a prophetic preacher telling the truth about America. And so I remember being in Hyde Park at the time, and there I was warming down. I'd finished my workout, and someone tapped me on the shoulder. I was pastor at the time. Dr. Wright had already retired and was actually out of the country. Someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, Rev, is that your church on the news? And I looked up. And I saw this person by the name of Sean Hannity going off about our church. And I said, bruh, I got to leave right now. And so at that moment, we ended up in the gauntlet, a media gauntlet, 40 outlets every particular Sunday. 40 outlets sticking their microphones in people's faces, demanding a quote that they hoped that they could use. But then the death threats began. Dr. Wright started receiving letters and emails. I started receiving letters and emails saying what they were going to do to me or to my family. Then the church started receiving letters and emails. We had to get bomb-sniffing dogs every single time we met as a community to go through the entire church. And I remember one night, because I wasn't getting any kind of sleep whatsoever, because every time I would see a stranger walking down the street, I was wondering, is this it? Is this the moment? So one night, heard some noise in the house. And Monica tapped me and said, you got to go check that out. And so I got up and grabbed my rod and my staff to comfort me by the name of Louisville Slugger. And I started looking around the house. There was some noise around the house. I heard the noise again, and I heard the noise coming out of my daughter's bedroom. I go into my daughter's bedroom. She is all of 5 years old. And there she is in the middle of her room, spinning around, dancing, saying, look, Daddy, I'm dancing. It was 3 a.m. I said, baby, in a fatherly voice, you need to go to bed right now. I had to preach in a few hours. But she kept on spinning. And then the Spirit stopped me and said, look at your daughter. She's dancing in the darkness. The darkness is not in her, but the darkness is around her. Can you yourself, Otis, learn from your daughter how to dance in the midst of darkness? I scrapped my sermon at that moment and then began to write very quickly everything that was flowing from my spirit. And then I stepped into the pulpit a few hours later. The sun had just come up. I had notes in front of me, all out of disjointed and whatnot, and stood in the pulpit that Sunday and said that we are called to dance in the darkness. That our job, if we are to transform this nation, is to dance in the darkness. How are we to dance? We are to hear that beat of the drum and recognize that we must dance with compassion and love and justice. And if this nation is to be the yet-to-be United States of America, we must learn how to dance in the darkness. And I say to you, Georgetown, can you dance in the darkness? In this midnight in America, in the challenges that we face in this democracy, can you dance in the darkness? But I say, if we learn how to dance, if we listen to the talking drum and understand the power of the drum major instinct, we will see transformation. No matter who you are, whether you are black or white, whether you are Jew or Gentile, whether you are atheist or Anglican, whether you're a Buddhist or Baptist, whether you're Muslim or Methodist, queer or Quaker, bougie or you're broke, whether you're urban or suburban, whether you're redneck or trap city, whether you're Pentecostal or Presbyterian, Hindu or holiness, Sikh or sanctified, whether you graduate magna cum laude or just thank you, Lord, there will be an opportunity for people to gather together, and we will see transformation in our nation, and we will be able to sing those words of that great bard from South Central LA by the name of Kendrick Lamar, and we can say together, we gonna be all right. We gonna be all right. May God bless you, and may God keep you, and let us dance in the dark.
We just had church. So now we have the opportunity to do something that we often don't get to do, which is ask questions of the preacher after a sermon. So if you have any questions, feel free to come to these mics. And I'll...
Now, I'm from North Carolina. I'm from down south. And so this is a lot more I'm more used to this than I am to a lot of stuff in D.C. But being in D.C., I wanted to visit the Martin Luther King Memorial, but specifically his square, right in front of the Lincoln Monument. I went last weekend, and it was kind of dark, so I couldn't really find it for a really long time. Eventually, I had to get on my knees, and I had to search around a little bit. The reason I couldn't find it is because people have been stepping over it, and you couldn't see his name anymore because the lettering had disappeared. Wow. And I guess, honestly, that's why I wanted to come today, just figure out, well, how do we make this content if we're forgetting it when we walk up the steps to see the Lincoln Monument and we're forgetting the man who stood there 60 years ago and delivered that sermon? So,
thank you for that. I mean, I'm gonna give me your name first.
Oh, I'm sorry, Clark.
Clark, okay, I'm going to quote you in a sermon because that's powerful, that we've been stepping over him. That image right there, and I think that's on so many levels, is what we have done historically. We've tried to step over. We have smeared the name because we have stepped on it. And I believe that there is a movement afoot in this nation, or really across the globe, of a new generation that is doing amazing work. Now, they may not have the mic of a media empire, but they are organizing locally all across this globe. And they are inspired by individuals and communities that have been deeply committed to linking love and justice together. And you, my brother, you are part of that community. And I thank you for raising that question.
Well, thank you, Reverend.
So the title of your new book is Dancing in the Darkness, and it's inspired by that story that you shared about your daughter. I'm wondering what you can share with students and faculty and friends who are here, and those who are worried about how to dance and don't know how to dance in the darkness, or are waiting for someone to choreograph that dance for them in the darkness.
Oh, wonderful question. Every person born has an innate rhythm. Children naturally dance, but then lose it later when people say you don't need to be doing that. And so it's the reclaiming of our joy, just like the drum major instinct that Dr. King is talking about, that innately every child, we have innately our creativity, our innate poetry, our purpose, our meaning. What will you do? And it doesn't have to be anything grand. That's part of the problem in our society. Everybody think, if I don't have 1 million likes, oh gosh, it's not worth anything. No, it's just the small actions that change everything. I'm really big on sacred serendipity. If Vernon Johns never applied to Oberlin,
Dr. King would never be at Dexter Avenue. I mean, just when you look at all of the inner workings of how he comes to Dexter, it takes a person that many of us have never heard of, who got put out of his own church, in order to set the stage so that he could be present in that moment. Let me give you another person, and one of my favorite persons in history is a person by the name of Drew Boudini Brown. Now, some people have never heard of him, but everybody here heard of Muhammad Ali, right? But you never heard of Drew Boudini Brown. Drew Boudini Brown was Muhammad Ali's corner man. So he is the one who came up with the poetry for Muhammad Ali when he said, "You float like a butterfly, you sting like a bee." He said, my job, he said, I can't teach you how to throw a punch. I can't tell you what right workout to do. He said, but when you come into the corner and you're hurt, I will always whisper in your ear, you're the greatest. Now get out there and do what you're supposed to do. And a few Sundays ago, I said at church, I said, everybody's got to find their Boudini. You need to have somebody in your corner who's got a Boudini spirit. And that can be transformative for an entire movement. So the Boudini spirit that we have to reclaim, and know that you don't need to do anything on some grand scale with 1 million likes and it's all on TV. Sometimes it's just the simple actions are enough to change the world.
Thanks for being with us. I'm Sultana, and I teach public relations ethics at Georgetown. So I'm sort of training and equipping the next generation of communicators to be ethical. So I was looking at your book, and something that really stuck with me was this idea of consecrating the chaos. I'm just going to read for a sec here. To consecrate is to make holy, to put it into service for good. In consecrating chaos, you engage it, tame it, name it, take what seemed out of control, and charge it with a duty. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about the power of language and words. So can you talk about that for today's everybody, really?
I appreciate that. So many people have connected with that chapter, and this idea that there is this false spiritual belief that we can get rid of chaos. Chaos is a part of existence. The beautiful thing for those who are in the scientific realm is that even when there's chaos, it must operate out of particular laws. So the sailor understands chaos in a unique way. He said, if I'm going to sail this sea, I'm not talking about the folk who use motorboats and all that other kind of stuff. I'm talking about the sailors. They understand that if I build my boat appropriately, meaning a rudder and a keel, to keep it balanced in chaos. Number two, if I catch the wind in chaos, even though the sea is rough, it's my job to catch the winds appropriately. And I never can sail in a direct straight line. Sailors have to go, they have to tack left and right. In other words, to get to my goal, it's never direct. I always have to deal with the chaos, but know how to handle it so it's in my service. It happens in basketball. I'm a big basketball fan, LeBron, by the way, from Ohio. And also MJ. I'm not throwing a shade at MJ now. But those people who are at the top of their game, they're able to slow the game down because basketball is a chaotic game. It's a transition game. Things are happening in the moment. And the beautiful thing about point guards is that point guards say that it's if I can pause the game and I can see where everybody's supposed to be, that I can manage the chaos because I can see what other people cannot see. And I think that that is the kind of spiritual ethic that we have to run. We have to engage the chaos, hold on to it. Black Lives Matter created a sailboat for us to be able to understand racial terror in the 21st century, utilizing not only technology and seeing the system of racial terror, specifically state-sponsored death from the police. They were able to build a sailboat. And that's what I believe that movements are consistently doing. They see the chaos. Chaos is designed to break people. systems that are chaotic. They use chaos to break people. And then resistance and resilient movements create sailboats in order to get to a new goal so that the system does not destroy them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lionel, thank you for your sermon. I think one of the things that I'm holding, and I'm still crafting this question, but I think recognizing that Dr. King holiday happened on Monday, I saw so many people referencing his name and his work, and it was outside of the context in which it existed in. And I always find that challenging in my work. My role and work is around racial justice. And I think sometimes I have to ask folks what they mean when they're talking about that, because it's so challenging, not even just defining it, but what does that look like in action? Like, how do we hold this in our head and hearts? And so I guess my question is, like, how do we emphasize what he was talking about in the context that he was talking about it and apply it to current day?
That's great. Growing up with my parents, who were both involved in the movement, my parents, and then also the village that I came out of at Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, there were elders in our community that would always correct you when you were using inappropriate grammar or language. Said, no, you're not going to say that. You want to say that again? They said, what, you're dangling that part of stuff? What are you doing? You know, I mean, they were always correcting you. We need the same type of spiritual grammar to correct people when they are misusing the spiritual grammar around a Dr. King, a Malcolm X, a Fannie Lou Hamer, an Angela Davis, so on and so on. So we first need those who can give us proper grammar. The second piece is that what you're doing here in terms of teaching the movement, so it is not being taught. There's nothing annoys me more than when I see someone on Fox quote Dr. King. I want to destroy my TV. I mean, it angers me to the point because it's inappropriate grammar. They're using a name and using people to employ it specifically around market corporate interests and a particular ideology. And we just have to have people who got good grammar, like yourself, and can make some corrections and keep correcting people so that we don't have a generation that grows up and thinks that there is a connection, no, I am throwing shade on this one. There is a connection between the Freedom Caucus and Dr. King. There is no. They're completely opposite in terms of their belief systems, and we need to be able to name that.
God bless you, Reverend Moss. You know, I'm standing here, so when you talked about everybody should have, and I'm hoping I pronounced the name right, a Bodini in their corner, I just jumped up. And I just heard the Spirit of the Lord say, just get up. And so as I was sitting there, I said, my God, I'm just so grateful that you're here. So I think that's what God wants me to tell you, that I'm so grateful that you're here at Georgetown University and that we got the story about Martin Luther King Jr. before he was Martin Luther King Jr. And I think what I want to say too, that everywhere you go, there will be a Bodini in your corner. And I just want to say I am that today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hi, Pastor Moss.
Hey, Mia, how you doing?
I'm good.
She's a Trinitarian, y'all. Trinitarian. Okay, all right.
So I've been here a year and a half. So I've done my exploring around D.C. So I want to piggyback off of what you said, the guy that blazed the trail. That's what I like to use, blaze the trail. So I was in D.C. Public Library. On the 4th floor, they have an exhibit. A lot of D.C. stuff, go-go music, all of that. But they have this one huge segment on Martin Luther King. Now, I'm not going to tell my age, but next month I'm in the 50 club, so next month I'll be 50-ish. And I never heard this. I've been in Chicago Public School where they do teach a lot of history, Black history, high school, all of that, but I never knew this. I never knew how much connection King had to DC and Howard University. But there was a particular sister, Nanny Burroughs. So again, she was like sort of a trailblazer for him as well. So I was blown away. I went back and was telling everybody, look, did y'all know? And so some of them already knew. I was like, oh, okay, I thought that. I've just, But for those who didn't know, like me, so I'm spreading that out so that they can go and find out about Nanny Burroughs and how she contributed to his movement as well. So I wanted to share that because you shared that I didn't know. So now I have two things under my belt.
Thank you, Mia. Oh my goodness. Okay. Minister Mahogany, Reverend Mahogany, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thank you for being here. My question for you is, you are a masterful storyteller. And a part of what is so transformative is that you don't just name folks, right, that we know. You also bring us into awareness of the stories that we may not know. And so I'm wondering, there's kind of two parts to this question. One, I'm wondering what you're reading that kind of helps you to open up the narrative and that you share with us. And the second part to that is, how do you continue to expose yourself to the stories that we may not have heard so that we can become better storytellers in this world?
Man, thank you, Mahogany. So I got to give a shout out to my friend, Minister Mahogany. She served as an intern at Trinity. She's just a brilliant sister, and the folks at Trinity just absolutely fell in love with her when she was working that summer. And everybody loves Minister Mahogany. But also, I want to add that she is a part of a group we created in partnership with Auburn Seminary, entitled the Prophetic Preaching Laboratory. And it brings together in the idea, and it really answers your question, Mahogany. I had the privilege of growing up with my parents, and just to give a background. So my father was one of the architects and leaders of what was called the Student Sit-In Movement of Atlanta, that desegregated Atlanta, that became the Movement for Human Rights. And then he became a lieutenant in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and a board member. He was the only board member, along with Coretta Scott King, that supported Dr. King's position for moving the movement to being an anti-war movement. Every other board member said, no, it's gonna get us in trouble. Pop and Coretta Scott King said, no, this is what y'all do. My mom was the office manager for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they literally met in the movement. Dr. King performed their wedding nuptials. And I always joke and say, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Dr. King, because he married my parents. But I heard stories that are not recorded. I heard the stories of when they would share about why they said Bayard Rustin was so brilliant. And they would sit there and talk about Bayard Rustin. I was like, you mean the guy I read in Taylor Branch's book? I was like, oh yeah, him. I was like, okay, thank you. You didn't tell me that earlier. I could have gotten an A on my test if I had known. Or the stories of Fannie Lou Hamer. They were very close with Fannie Lou Hamer also. So these were oral stories. And so the Prophetic Preaching Lab was designed, for those of you who are not familiar, was to put people in connection with this oral library of individuals before they pass away. Because when a person passes, we lose a library. That's an African proverb. So one is being in partnership and listening to elders. I'm going to share a story. I don't think I shared the story with you, Mahogany. I'll share it with everybody. I was at the Progressive National Baptist Convention years ago, and there was C.T. Vivian, Billy Kyles, Reverend Jesse Jackson, I think it was Andrew Young, and my father. And they were talking about when Dr. King came to Chicago in 1966. And there was a minister by the name of J.H. Jackson who was not supportive of the movement, but he was considered to be one of the great preachers. So they decided they were going to show up on the front row And either he was going to have to acknowledge that the movement was coming to Chicago, because he was really supportive of the Daley community. And as Daley was the mayor at the time. He said he's going to have to acknowledge that we're there, or if he doesn't acknowledge us, it'll be an embarrassment to him. So they basically going to protest at church, is basically what they were trying to do, throw shade at Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson never acknowledged them. He just said, we have some friends with us. But as they're telling the story, these elders, they talk about the fact that here they were on my father wasn't present with them, but they were on the front row of Olivet, as I told you, the black folk like to name their church as Olivet, Olivet Baptist Church, and he begins to preach. And I hear C.T. Vivian telling the story that, yeah, Dr. King, I looked over to the right, and Dr. King had his head down between his legs because his message was so powerful. Everybody on the front row was trying to keep from shouting, amen. And they were talking about, and this is what I heard Gardner C. Taylor say. He said he was probably one of the most gifted ministers he'd ever heard, but he was on the wrong side of history. And he then said, and I remember him saying that because I was asking him the question, Dr. Taylor that was, we were talking one time, and he said, for your generation, make sure you're on the right side of history. Those are stories. So it's listening to elders, number one. Number two, I believe that within the ministry and preaching and whatnot is an art form. So it is my responsibility to read and listen to other artists. So Zora Neale Hurston is a muse for me. Octavia Butler is a muse for me. But then reading poetry is very helpful to me because poets are able to frame things in ways, especially with terse language, is important. I just picked up a poet, it's not a book of poetry, but he's a poet, Ross Gay, a book entitled Inciting Joy, where he speaks about in essays, talking about that in America, we don't like to talk about joy because we think joy is sequestered from sorrow. And he's saying that when you embrace your sorrow, you can also find those great moments of joy. And he starts the book out talking about when he discovers his father has cancer and walking with his father, who he deeply loved, and what a joyful moment was created in the middle of one of the most painful moments in his life, because he got a chance to embrace his father in ways that he had never embraced him in his childhood. So reading other artists, listening to artists who, singers, musicians, whatever they may be, as you know, I'm a big jazz fan, and hip hop, and sometimes just staring in front of paintings of people who are doing amazing work and finding out how and why. Cinematic people. I love Akira Kurosawa, who is a Japanese director who influenced everyone from Spike Lee to George Lucas to Steven Spielberg, who is absolutely magnificent in what he's able to do on screen and how he paints the issues of life in his structure. I'm sorry, I'm nerding out, forgive me. But his issues of life by talking about tension and release. So every scene has tension and release. And he believes that all of life has tension and release. And I think that looking at other, people who are artists, it should fill your cup up. It should fill your cup. So thank you. It's good seeing you too. Tell your family I said hello. Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. I think you just gave some students the permission to watch some movies in between the books. Well, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for taking time to answer these questions, and we look forward to having you sign books afterwards. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, who's going to close us off, and thank you all for coming to teach the speech. It's been a great day.
I don't really really know how to close after this. It's been an incredible day. I'm so grateful to Pastor Moss and Dr. Crawford. Thank you again for being here with us today, for illuminating and enriching our understanding of Dr. King's Drum Major Instinct sermon. We are so grateful for your knowledge and wisdom, those are different, for your presence and for your time here with us today. I also have to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has worked so hard to make this happen, our CSJ colleagues, Andrea, Lucia, and Jessica, as well as grad assistants, Haya and Marcella. We are grateful for the support of our campus ministry colleagues, especially Rev Grissom and Rev Tony. Thank you this afternoon, and Imam Hendy and Chaplain Tony this morning. Thanks again to Olivia Henry, I see you, for offering our student reflection this year. Finally, no event at Georgetown can happen without the facilities and hospitality crew that work to make our spaces inviting and keep us nourished throughout the day. I'd also like to thank Russell and Blue Street Productions for doing our AV and live stream as well. As we depart, we encourage you to reflect on what you've learned today. What next steps will you take? What connections have you made today? What ideas do you want to explore more? We also invite you to stop by the book table. I don't know how you can not buy his book after hearing where the title came from. I have to. I have to. And you can get a signed copy. He'll be out there at the table out front. With that, I will say, go in peace. Thank you for being here.